So I don't think it's a stretch by any means to say that Plato is one of, if not the single greatest philosopher of all time. For those of you who maybe aren't as familiar with philosophy, there's a ton of reasons why Plato is considered to be this. Big part of the reason is that he's one of the first. Another reason is the absolute breadth of topics he covered. He covered literally everything. Like, you name it, it's in a Plato dialogue somewhere, right? There's a quote by somebody whose name I don't remember that says, all of philosophy is footnotes to Plato. And as much as maybe that quote's a little bit of an exaggeration, it's definitely not disputed, right? I want to talk about why I think Plato is so great. Not so much for being Plato. I like Plato a lot. I think he's one of the most fun philosophers to read. And I think his ideas are interesting. I think it's actually very impressive how ahead of his time he was. Like the fact that his work still holds up today in our social climate, in our way of thinking, it's very interesting. I think it's also a great entry place if you're somebody who maybe hasn't read as much philosophy to read, because we're at like a point where Plato's ideas just kind of do make up the world around us. Like, maybe not directly, like we're not living in the world from the Republic, but like Plato's ideas influence literally everything you've ever heard. So like, you're gonna hear a lot of things in the Plato dialogue that you're like, I know that. I can connect that to this other thing, X, Y, Z. I'm not here to talk about Plato's ideas or him as a philosopher, though. I want to talk about his style of philosophy, because I think that as much as he's unique in the way he does philosophy, so Plato's very unique in the way he does things. You might have caught before I referred to his stuff as dialogues rather than writings, right? And that's because they're just that. They're dialogues. You can read a Plato dialogue as if it's a play. Like, if you have a friend who's just as insufferable as you, which I'm not fortunate enough to have, you can sit down with them and read it out like it's a play. You can literally do that. This is unique. To my knowledge, there are no other mainstream, ginormous philosophers that do this. Plato's also one of the first. It's interesting, right? Because usually somebody who's like the first to do something, they diffuse, and like everybody kind of takes a little bit from how they do it. More people just took from what Plato did rather than how he did it. Meaning that most philosophy afterwards takes the form of probably what you're most familiar with, right? Like just a lengthy writing, an essay, a treatise, something like that. It's very, I'm not even gonna say rare. To my knowledge, I don't think anybody else does it like Plato with these dialogues. And I think that the reason I love this so much, this idea of a dialogue, even though sometimes I think Plato doesn't need it, I think it's like the perfect way to do things. I think actually this idea of a dialogue, all the way back from ancient Greece, when Plato was doing this, speaks more so to the modern way that we do discourse through things like podcasts and social media than anything else. And I think the reason why I like it so much is because so much of other philosophy, right, when it is just somebody writing an essay, they're going, this thought, expand, get to this thought, expand on that. When you're doing that, inherently, you want to get to a conclusion. You want to get to a statement. You want to get to a thesis. We all have been through school, or most of us. We can all relate to the idea of like, so you make your thesis, and then you defend it, and then you go against one of the counterpoints, and it's the they say, I say. We all are familiar with that. And I think one of the problems with that, when you're doing something like philosophy, is just how problematic it is to come up with a rule at all when it comes to being a philosopher, right? I'm going to use Kant as an example here. Kant is one of obviously the most out there philosophers. He's really hard to understand, but he has this idea that like, if you're going to do a moral action, you need to apply it to like everything, right? So let's say somebody calls me right now. I have a landline right next to me when I'm recording for some reason today. Somebody calls me, they go, I am going to do a huge crime right now if you don't say the sky is red, right? If you don't lie, if you don't make something up, right? Obviously the sky's blue. We all know the sky's blue, but this guy is like, if you don't say the sky is red, I am going to hurt a bunch of people. I'm going to do a bad thing. You name the bad thing. Let's say people will die or whatever. Obviously, I think most of us would agree that the best thing to do there is to be like, okay, the sky's red. You got that. Like, cool. I don't have to do anything. I have to just say a line and I save a bunch of lives. I think anyone would be like, that's cool, right? But Kant says that's not a good idea because he advocates for like making all your morality universal, right? You have to say not only the sky is red, but you have to think everybody, what if everybody did this? What if everybody treated this as if they could lie? What if everybody was lying? You wouldn't want to live in a world where everybody was lying, so you can never lie, right? And obviously Kant's purpose in doing this is to basically like say you're never an exception, right? You're never somebody who's going to exist above the rules, as so many people do, you know, especially like on the internet. I feel like it's so common to hear somebody kind of espouse their, I think Jordan Peterson does this all the time, and it's one of the reasons I think like some of his philosophical work on morality is so annoying to me. Just ignoring everything else that he's ever done as like a commentator or whatever, his just philosophical work itself has always been kind of annoying to me because he advocates for Christian morality, but it's like, I'm an atheist. So he's kind of going like, you all need this God thing to make you stay in line. I'm an atheist, I don't even need that. But like, at least that's what he did early on. I know he's changed up later or whatever, but Kant is saying that's a really bad idea. This rule was advocating against that. It's going, just imagine everybody was you and did as you do, what would the world look like? And that's how he comes up with his moral principles, right? Morality is a famously hard thing to nail down, and I don't mind the way Kant's doing it. I don't mind the fact that, you know, he's trying to come up with this universal principle to make us think. And I think it's also important to understand that a lot of Kant's work is not so much trying to come up with answers, but trying to make people think, trying to make them philosophize, right? So I don't have a problem with this in general, but I have a problem with the way it works, right? Like that's a great idea, and it's actually pretty impressive that he can come up with something like that. I think that's awesome. Obviously, influences a ton of stuff later on. But with that, we get this bizarro scenario where now, like, a bunch of people just got hurt, in this hypothetical, because I'm following Kant's rules of morality, and I can't even lie because of that to save lives. Because I have to imagine, what if everybody was doing that? You see what I mean? In Kant's effort here to come up with a solution, he ends up having this backwards scenario. You know, we end up with imperfections, even though his solution is there to make things simpler. It ends up complicating it in so many cases, right? And that's where I think the problem lies in this type of linear writing, in this writing of A to B to C and having a conclusion, because I think having any sort of conclusion is always going to be, it's always going to be problematic in one way or another. You know what I mean? Like, it's always going to lead, not always, I guess always is kind of a little bit hypocritical. I'm sort of coming up with a conclusion of my own right there if I'm saying always, but it oftentimes will lead to a lot of problems because it ends up with rules, right? The point of philosophy is, of course, not to just think about things and be like, who can come up with the best thing? Like Kant is coming up with something really impressive here. The point of philosophy is not that. It's to teach us how to think, how to go about things, right? Morality is a great example here because morality is famously hard to pin down, right? There are very few philosophers that have been able to come up with like agreeable principles of morality, and even if they do come up with agreeable principles, it's oftentimes just like, do what you want, you know? Or things that go in the opposite direction, arguments against morality existing at all that are more concrete, right? So something like this would almost be better suited in a dialogue form, where it's just a conversation between a bunch of different ideas, right? Within Kant's idea here, right, of having this, like, you need to apply this one thing to everybody, you end up with this hole that we just discussed, right? A really annoying thing. If this was in a dialogue form, you could have somebody voice that annoying thing, right? And it's almost a way to have both things exist, a very interesting conclusion and nuance. And that's why I think that Plato, what he does, addresses this inherent flaw in philosophy of coming up with any sort of blanket statement, always leaving something to be, to be questioned, to be a hole. It's always going to leave a hole. And something people often say is like, okay, you can't take things that literally. Of course, Kant, as much as he means this blanket statement, he of course would make this exception, right? A common thing you'll hear is like, we don't call it a two-headed snake because some snakes have two heads. We call it a snake because that's what most things look like, right? Of like, Rules are not always meant for every scenario. There's always nuance built in if you're a logical person. And that works. Like, obviously, if me and my friend were just having a conversation, and I was like, don't lie, lying is bad, my friend would understand that, like, of course, Dice would not want me to not lie and end up with all these people getting hurt in the sky is red scenario, right? So that makes sense. But when it's philosophy, I think it almost has a heavier burden. I think this really gets useful as you get later into philosophy too, which is why I think it's so interesting that Plato was the first to do it. Because sometimes Plato's ideas are actually less suited to being in these dialogues because they're establishing. I want to say something here that's like, obviously that's a crazy hot take, I think, because a lot of people will not say Plato's ideas are simple at all. And I think that Plato's ideas have been so widely discussed because he let them exist in this form of a dialogue. This is actually one of my hot takes as somebody who has no philosophy experience in any academia ever, and is just making stuff up in a cube while painting 3 colors on a canvas. I think that Plato taking an idea that is more simple, as some of his ideas can be, and making them into these dialogues where they exist in this very in-motion form, where allowing for a ton of nuance and questioning to happen in real time, is why there's been so much opportunity to discuss him. I think that sort of abstraction, right? And I think that's actually why, and I'm joking about me being like the least authoritative source on philosophy ever. I'm never somebody you should quote on any of this stuff. I want to make that very clear. But I think the reason why I do enjoy the fact that I also don't have any experience in philosophy is because I'm allowed when reading these things to look at it with whatever perspective I want. And I think almost looking at some of Plato's dialogues, not from the perspective of being just direct philosophy, but almost as being works of art, as being plays, as being abstractions of thought and of experience that lead to this philosophy by proxy of abstraction, not for abstraction's sake. Does that make sense? It leads to philosophy happening because it's in motion. It's not in motion because of the philosophy. And I think that's why we've gotten so much out of Plato's work, like in all of human history. And I think this abstraction would be really useful when discussing a more complicated idea. Like when discussing, like if the myth of Sisyphus was a dialogue, I think it would actually be a lot more meaningful. I actually think this is one of the reasons why Camus is so great, because I think when he takes his philosophy and puts it into something like The Stranger or like The Fall, he allows it to become so much more powerful by that abstraction, by turning it into something fictional. I love that. I'm a huge fan of that. And that's one of the reasons why I think that there's an inherent flaw in how philosophy happens. This idea of having a conclusion, having an argument to back up, is much less... I think it lends itself to much less actual thought than having something in motion, like a dialogue or like a conversation. I think that's why it's awesome that as much as it's not like philosophers are getting online and, Joe Rogan is not hosting conversations between Norm Finkelstein and Noam Chomsky. It's not like we're getting a Chomsky-Foucault debate happening on the podcast circuit right now. But I do think there is some value in this return to form of all these podcasts happening, because I think that it's almost shown what we've known all along, that ideas, simple or complex, are better understood in a nuanced conversation without a conclusion than they are in a presented form of an essay. That's my hot take here today, guys. This is the painting, new color palette, loving the colors. I mean, maybe I'm just excited because we're in a new color palette, and I don't even know if these will pick up well on camera, but man, this purple's deep. This is a deep purple right here. This is craziness happening on this canvas. This is insane. I've been looking at those colors that we were working with last time, guys. Terrible, boring, ugly, one note, ugly, dimension ugly. They're ugly colors. These are colors. I feel like I'm all grown up. But yeah, go check out the Instagram. This will be up later this week. And until next time, guys, gals, and pals, my name is Max Dice. This is Paint&Talk episode 184. I'm here every morning, painting and talking with you all.